All right, I want to welcome everyone here to the rental licensing webinar series that we've been having. And this is being put on by the Planning and Code Administration Department with the Neighborhood Services team. And what we're going to provide to you today is a technical review of one aspect of the property maintenance code. What we're going to do is just trying to not give you a full comprehensive review, but just give you basically the most common situations and how we come across them and just our interpretation with that part of the code. As always, if you have any questions, just consult with our office so we can answer those, and don't use this webinar as a how-to guide to guide you for any type of renovations or determinations on your property. Just always consult with our office and contact one of our inspectors. Our goal with this is just basically give you a better understanding of this particular code section so you might know something as an inspection comes along. To ask any questions, you can always tap or click on the Q&A button. That's either on the bottom or the side of your screen, just depends on how you have something oriented. And you can just type in your question as you're thinking about it, and we'll get to them as time allows at the very end. And today we're going to walk you through the technical aspects of ceiling heights. Basically, how are they calculated? And there are some different kind of codes related to the ceiling height as far as some exceptions to the rule. It is only one code. Sean is going to be our expert for today. And Sean, he is certified as a property maintenance inspector and has been doing this a long time. So Sean can certainly give you some guidance through this, and I'm going to turn everything to him here. Sean, it's all you.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. As many of you probably know, there are many codes that apply to determining whether is habitable or not, or specific rooms habitable or not. And ceiling heights is one of them. And as you may know, Paul covered in a previous webinar how to calculate occupancy one way. Just solely focus on ceiling heights and the requirements in different areas of the structure. And again, this is just one requirement that the city of Hagerstown has. It's part of the property maintenance code. And we'll also discuss at the same time 4 exceptions to the codes that we're going to discuss a little bit later. But the first question we might ask, well, what is a code requirement when it comes to habitable spaces? When we say habitable spaces, we're talking about spaces that are used for living, sleeping, eating, or cooking. They include hallways, corridors, laundry areas, bathrooms, toilet rooms, and habitable basement areas. And they are to have a ceiling height of not less than 7 feet. So 7 feet, that's kind of a magic number. Why 7 feet as a requirement? Well, there are several factors that go into that 7 feet to be a habitable space. One reason is to simply provide an adequate volume of air. So what's built into room calculations, width and length, is also the height, so that basically that habitable space has enough air to be breathed by the occupants. The next reason is fire safety. Well, you might be thinking, well, what does ceiling height have to do with fire safety? Well, interestingly enough, there was a study that was published in 1969, and it was a model for calculating smoke fill-in when it comes to rooms and heights and so forth. And they came through with figuring out a calculation, the adequate size, which includes ceiling height, to enable someone to adequately get out of their home safely. So that's that calculation that's taken into consideration with that, the 7-foot rule. So think about this. As we all learned probably very early on, we learned fire safety, and where does smoke go? Well, it goes to the ceiling. It rises, doesn't it not? So if you think about it, if the ceiling was too short, you're sleeping through the night comfortably, you're awakened by a fire or the smoke, you stand up, and because your ceiling is so low, now your head is in the smoke, and now you can't breathe. So that's another vital reason for that ceiling height to be built in, so that you could comfortably be able to escape, be able to somewhat breathe as best as possible outside of that ceiling being too low. And then lastly, there is really a psychological effect as well. As an example, how many of us have walked into an area uh, where the ceiling or surface above us was real low? And what did you automatically do? Well, you ducked down. You felt different, didn't you? Because now you're trying to judge the space and you're not wanting to hit your head. So there's a psychological aspect too with ceiling height, making one feel comfortable in that space. Now, a comment that we get from time to time is that how old is this code? It's so hard to meet, and we do get that. So the code that we currently use was adopted in 2008, and that was based on the 2003 International Property Maintenance Code. And so the Property Maintenance Code is meant to take into consideration older homes, but at the same time, establishing minimum standards to meet safety requirements. So it's not an old requirement. So we're trying to find that balance, safety versus understanding, very old structures. So what has been done over time to be able to meet that? In fact, the fact is that this is not really an old requirement overall, because in 1955, then there was a minimum ceiling height requirement set, which was 7 feet 6 inches. And at that time was being enforced by the city of Hagerstown. Then the Property Maintenance Code from 1981 to the mid 1990s established a minimum ceiling height of 7 feet 4 inches in Hagerstown. So based on adoptions of codes over time in Hagerstown, we've actually lowered the ceiling height to 7 feet. And so based on a number of studies, it's not just something that the city of Hagerstown came up with, but a number of experts have found that this is really the lowest ceiling height that you could comfortably go for the reasons that we've already mentioned. Now, early on, I mentioned that there are 4 exceptions to that 7-foot ceiling rule. And we're going to take a little bit of time to go through those 4 exceptions in the Property Maintenance Code. So let's talk about the first exception. And this exception applies to 1 and 2 family dwellings. And these are areas or situations where you may have beams or girders in their spaces. And they cannot be less than 4 feet on center and project not more than 6 inches below the required ceiling height. So again, remember, this is just 1 and 2 family dwellings only. We're not talking about multiple family dwellings, 3 or more units. So just to break that down a little bit, the ceiling height still must be 7 feet, and this exception permits projections below the required ceiling height. Again, 4 feet from center to center, and we can't count that cavity space because the spacing has to be at least 4 feet on center, and joists are typically 16 inches on center. So you may have the idea of removing joists to meet that. Just remember, now you're talking about structural things, and most likely a building permit is going to be required if you're making any type of adjustments or changes that drastic. And of course, you want to make sure that you see our office for a permit as well. And so the last part of that exception that we just talked about, allowable projection into the ceiling height, is that they can project no more than 6 inches below the required ceiling height. As you see in that diagram that sometimes we typically will see when it comes to beams and LVLs. Now let's talk about the second exception. Now we're talking about basement rooms. We're still talking about 1 and 2 family dwellings. And we're talking about basement rooms that are exclusively used for laundry, study, or recreation purposes. Again, having a ceiling height of not less than 6 feet 8 inches, and with not less than 6 feet 4 inches of clear height under beams, girders, and ducts, and similar obstructions, as we mentioned earlier. Again, like that last exception, again, this is only permitted in 1 and 2 family dwellings. Multifamily dwellings of 3 or more do not allow for this exception. Now, as we first mentioned also, laundry rooms, they're specifically mentioned as needing 7 feet of ceiling height, but in the basement area, this exception permits ceiling heights down to 6 feet 8 inches. And so this minimum requirement for basements is only for laundry purposes and not for habitable spaces. And we might also add that this exception does allow the ceiling height to be lower under beams, girders, and ducts and similar obstructions, but only under those areas, not for the entire ceiling height. So for example, if you have a beam or a duct or other items that project into that 6 feet 8 inch requirement, they are permitted, but again, they must have a clearance of less than 6 feet 4 inches from the bottom of that projection to the floor. And again, just to reemphasize, we're talking about an exception that applies to 1 and 2 family homes for the basement laundry rooms and recreation rooms and basement studies. Now, we mentioned study, and sometimes what can happen is people will confuse a study and maybe it migrates over to a bedroom. But in this case, we're talking about something that is used not for a habitable space. It's really just used for a study. And if you recall, Donnie mentioned earlier in a webinar that means of egress and emergency exits from the basements. If you do have a bedroom down there, remember that you need to have the proper egress requirements for that as well. But again, we're talking about a study room that may be used for paperwork, computer work, or reading, but it is not used for sleeping. So this lower ceiling height is permitted in this area because this area would only be used occasionally, and it would not adversely affect the occupant's health or safety. Now let's talk about our third exception. And this is specifically for laundry rooms in multifamily structures of 3 or more residential units. And what this exception allows is ceiling heights down to 6 feet 8 inches in basement laundry rooms, again, used exclusively for laundry purposes. And there are the same permitted projections of beams, girders, and ducts and similar obstructions. And the measurement from the bottom of the projection to the floor must be no less than 6 feet 4 inches. Now, you may have a recreation or reading room in the basement of a multifamily structure, and there, that ceiling height for those rooms must be 7 feet. The exception we're talking about here that we just mentioned is only for laundry rooms, that is 6 feet 8 inches. And again, we're talking about a space that is only used occasionally. It's not going to ordinarily affect the safety or the health of the occupants. And then finally, let's consider our fourth and last exception to the 7-foot ceiling height requirement. It might sound a little bit complex in the beginning, but we'll break it down and talk about it to really understand it. So here's how the exception reads. Quote, rooms occupied exclusively for sleeping, study, or similar purposes, and having a sloped ceiling over all or part of the room with a clear ceiling height of at least 7 feet over not less than 1/3 of the required minimum floor area. In calculating the floor area of such rooms, only those portions of the floor area with a clear ceiling height of 5 feet or more shall be included. So what is that basically saying? Well, first of all, again, we're talking about an area that's used for sleeping and study rooms only. No other rooms are permitted to have a sloped ceiling. So what this exception allows for is sloped ceilings in spaces such as in 1.5-story structures or on 3rd floor habitable attics, where typically you have those sloped ceilings. And Paul will cover later on that habitable 3rd floor space in more detail. So look for that next week. So again, we've got an exception for sloped ceilings. And there are other items in this exception, but let's look at them overall in the room design. So if you notice in the diagram, most of the habitable spaces we come across have a finished ceiling from peak to the floor. But by this code exception, we can only consider the space to as low as 5 feet. So basically, from the very peak down the ceiling to where it meets 5 feet above the floor, that's where we have to stop being able to allow for that area of the room. Anything beyond that cannot be counted. So we look at the ceiling height, and the ceiling height must be at least 7 feet for 1/3 of the room area. And what that simply means is, as an example, is that if you have a room that's 12 feet wide, and 1/3 of that would be 4 feet of the room, that has to meet that 7-foot ceiling height. So the diagram explains it pretty nicely, but it gives you a general idea of how we calculate that habitable space based on a ceiling height there. So we really hope that you have a little bit of a better understanding of what is involved when it comes to ceiling heights. And our office does take into consideration things like original home designs and their ceiling heights. They do come along from time to time. The way things were built way back then were just different. But most of the time, what we do run into is that spaces that have lower ceiling heights, typically what's happened is some type of conversion was done earlier, and it was done without permits, so it wasn't properly inspected. The work was done, and then we may find out about it after the fact. But nonetheless, don't shy away. Don't think that there are not options. There are ways to meet the 7-foot requirement at times. They don't always mean something drastic like having to lower a roof or raise a floor. There may be other options to be able to do that. So what we would ask you to do is just simply consult our office before you make any alterations. And then certainly we could arrange an on-site visit. An inspector could meet with you and help you to come up with some options to try to help you to meet that code in a safe way. Now, from time to time, we will get questions from individuals when it comes to these type of requirements. Some of them are very, very common. For example, some might ask, well, if I can't meet the challenge of this ceiling height, I can't get any higher, can I just rent to short people? Now, you may laugh, but we do get that question. But the answer is no. And you could probably think, obviously, why. Nobody can guarantee that always it'll be short people to rent that space, right? The space itself still has to meet the code requirement, regardless who occupies the space. It has to be safe for anyone who would potentially rent that space. Another question that we get is that if I have a space with original design and it doesn't meet the 7-foot ceiling height, are other requirements available that I have to meet? Well, again, as we mentioned, there's always maybe a case-by-case basis that we can consider. And again, the best thing to do is just to set up an on-site visit, and we can come up with some options perhaps to help you out. So thank you for paying attention to this webinar.
All right, thanks, Sean, for giving us all that information there. One point for clarification, you said lower the ceiling or raise the floor. I think you got them backwards, right? Raise the roof or lower the floor.
Maybe I have a new method. I don't know.
but as Sean mentioned there, we do get questions now, and certainly you can answer any, or we could you can submit any questions that you might have right now. We know that we do not always answer every question that might be out there, but of course, if you do have a question, don't hesitate to reach out to our office at any time. I want to thank Sean for always explaining these types of code requirements. This is a very difficult one because it is just one code with a couple exceptions to the rule, and we're trying to break things down for everyone to better understand. And we know that Sean didn't cover every aspect or every potential outcome of what you might have at any of your properties, but certainly always just consult with our office if you have any questions. We recognize that Hagerstown's very unique, and as Sean and I were preparing for this webinar, we talked about different situations that I can recall over the years of coming across with lower ceiling height situations, and each home is very unique. And as Sean said, every time I walk into one of those, I'm always ducking down a little bit. It's just gives you that natural feel of just kind of ducking down. Our goal is just basically to give you some better knowledge of this particular code so that you have a better understanding of it and might be able to understand what we're looking for before an inspection happens. Again, if you have any particular questions, please always just email us. If you have anything, you can always email codecompliance@hagerstownmd.org, where we can answer those questions for you. And you know, if you have something now, you can certainly submit that as well. I want to always kind of open things up to any type of general questions. To add on some of the things that Sean had kind of went over, there was always options that are available to people out there rather than thinking of the raising of the roof or lowering the floor if you happen to be in a basement area. Did you might be able to come up with? There's sometimes carpet can add too much of a distance in there, where you could essentially look at removing the carpet and the padding and doing some sort of like floating floor. There's always different options available to try to meet that requirement. At times we've seen things with drop ceilings, and then you take a look at the drop ceiling there, and you're looking, and all of a sudden there's inches of space that are available that way, so you can actually meet the requirement. So always think of that there are options to go with that you actually have maybe within your existing space before you're actually looking at doing major modifications to the property. Sean, I'm not seeing any questions coming in right now. You kind of gave a couple common questions that we come across, and that might have answered some of the people that we have online with us here today. So again, if anyone does have any questions, don't hesitate to contact our office. An inspector can always come out and meet with you to go over things and explain what some of your options actually are before you venture down any type of remodeling or renovations to the property. Just always consult with the office first. I want to thank everyone for being part of today's webinar. We appreciate your participation here. And again, make sure you sign up for our next webinar. This will be the last one of this fall series that we've been doing. And that will be where, as Sean had already said, I'm going to kind of lead you through what makes a third floor attic. How can I make that habitable? And that's going to rely on a lot of the webinars that we've already covered previously, as far as like when Donnie went over the emergency escape requirements or means of egress. Then I actually went over overcrowding as well. And Sean just went over what the ceiling height requirements are for those sloped ceilings that you typically come across in these third floor attics. And then also, as Jason discussed, what's going to require a permit. So there's a lot of things, the previous webinars, that we want to make sure you reference back as well to get a better understanding. But we're going to kind of go over that here next week, and that will close out our fall webinar series. So again, I thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.